the sound of the Goldberg Variations by Johann Sebastian Bach, being played by my guest this morning, Sarah Grunstein, all the way from the Big Apple in New York. Wonderful Australian performer, currently in the Big Apple, and standing by to chat to us this morning on Dunera. Welcome, and welcome to all of our viewers, in particular from New York. Welcome, Sarah. Hello, and welcome to Dunera.
Hello, Geoff. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Such a pleasure to be here.
Delighted to have you. And in these very, 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 very weird times, amazing to be sitting there, seeing you at the piano, ahead of what I might say is a treat awaiting us at this time next week, or a little later in the morning next week, when we're going to tune in and hear you live from New York in a special salon performance, a soirée. But you can talk more about that later when we give people a bit of a treat. I'm certainly preview what you're going to be doing for us then. But firstly, welcome to Dunera, and thank you for joining us. A wonderful opportunity to catch up with a very, very favourite Australian performer, Australian Jewish performer. So for Dunera viewers especially, many, many, many wonderful angles. I want to talk to you all about your music, what you've been doing in New York, to hear about the beginning of the Sarah Grunstein story. But I'm going to take you right back to the beginning, because the story of your parents is something that connects most of us in the Jewish community, and is pretty much the beginning of it all. Take us back to the 40s and to your parents, please, and how they met and what was happening for them.
So, as you know, and as I think some of my audience members know, each of my parents, my mother and my father, were Holocaust survivors. My mother, known fondly as Hanya, was born in Poland in a small town 60 miles from Warsaw, a town called Tomaszów Mazowiecki. And when she was 6 years old, she contracted polio. She was one of the few survivors in Europe at that time few child survivors to survive polio. It was quite extraordinary. Her mother, my grandmother, must have been an amazing person, because she recruited doctors from all over Poland to help my mother. And my mother was also helped by a step aunt who had survived polio in the generation before, and taught my mother courage and took her walking and swimming, and my mother survived this virus with very little incapacity. However, it must certainly have been obvious to the Nazis, and somehow, even though she was in several concentration camps, including Auschwitz, she survived Auschwitz.
Meanwhile, your father also wound up in Auschwitz, among many others.
Yeah.
How many camps did he end up being in? It was extraordinary.
My father was incarcerated in 14 concentration camps. If I may, for the sake of history,
Please.
he was not in Auschwitz. He was in, but one of them was Dachau.
Mm.
He and his brother and a small group of his friends would occasionally escape the camps and get caught again. Sometimes they were just transferred from camp to camp. My father was also an artist, and among the many tasks assigned to him, one of them was painting portraits of the Nazi officers. He and his best friend, Joseph Koplevich, collected metal scraps from the aeroplane factory where they were assigned to build Nazi planes. They collected the scraps. They made a cigarette box, a tiny box. On the front of this box, my father engraved a sailing boat. He used some obviously blunt utensil. On the back of the box, which is only about this big, uh, he inscribed with that blunt knife the names of each of the concentration camps where he became a prisoner, with the date of entry and the date of exit.
So
And
I have a picture of that in front of me as we speak, because you alerted me to this. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has this on display. It's an extraordinary piece. It tells exactly that story of Joseph Koplowitz, the slave labor camp, etc., and of course how Benham Grunstein um, engraved on it. And it's there for us all to see, and one can Google that and find that in a flash. It's extraordinary. But continue, because their story, and of course your uncle as well, was.
two things are amazing there. One is that each of those men and their friends and whoever survived uh,
Mm.
um, that history is a miracle.
Part of it being their skill and their artistry, by the sound of it too, making themselves useful to the Nazis. I mean,
I,
those portraits must have been of some value to them.
as a child, Geoff, I often asked my father, not too many times because I could tell he didn't want to think about that time in history, but I would occasionally ask him how it was he thought he survived. And he said, miracle after miracle after miracle. And he added, and I could do anything with my hands. Uh, but I never forget his words about the miracles, because uh, many people had skills with their hands and other skills, and
No, that
they
wasn't enough.
died in one, as we know, in a split second. Their lives could be gone at whim, or for any reason.
Did he
So
have music as well? Was he a music lover?
my father was definitely a music lover, as was my mother. My father wanted, when he immigrated to Australia, he wanted to establish himself as an artist as a first career. He also told me when I was a child, well, Sarah, I realized very quickly I couldn't raise a family on 5 guineas a month, which must be the equivalent of our $8, uh, if even that. And so he ended up going into the rag trade, as we call it. However, he
Smartest.
was an
Smartest.
artist, painted his entire life since about the 1960s. Every weekend he went out with his colleagues from the Royal Art Society in Sydney. They would go to a beautiful landscape on a Sunday morning, and by Sunday at 2 p.m., my father came home with a finished painting. And also, often during the week, he attended classes and taught just to paint with his colleagues, and ended up teaching classes, becoming a director for a while at the Royal Art Society. So he was an avid artist and exhibited several times, many times, in his, what we call his other career. And my mother too was a music lover. I grew up with her words saying, Sarah, art and music make the world a more beautiful place. So for somebody that survived what she did, and also similarly with my father, I think what stays with me is, uh, in spite of their incredible tragic histories, they always found the beauty, the positive, and goodness. They were extraordinary people, and our home was filled with art and music.
it's an amazing gift to survive the horrors of the Holocaust and to come out with an optimism and with an energy for life. And my own father managed the same thing, and that's no judgment on those who are haunted forever too, because we cannot see into the minds of others and what they've experienced and how they respond. But I'm always amazed by a story like yours when we have art and music and optimism, as you said, coming out of that experience and looking forward, and then imbuing their children. For you, of course, have a brother as well. But you as an artist, imbuing you with a love of music, and then encouraging you, um, and uh, and uh, and setting you on your path. Tell me, how did you start? So, what was the beginning of your musical life?
So the
With that
beginning of
background.
life, I one of my earliest memories, uh, and I remember I was doing this when I was 3 years old. Before I was playing the piano, our living room had a record player, and on that record player was music, classical music, including piano music, orchestral music, Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf for children, music of Broadway shows, Oklahoma, uh, every kind of music, the popular music of the time, and I would dance around the living room. And I actually remember doing this. Uh, that said, my brother, who's 6 years older than me, was already having piano lessons pretty much uh, around the time I was born. And his second teacher, Mrs. Metaxas, used to come to our home to teach him. And I loved Harry's piano lessons. I used to sit in Mrs. Metaxas' lap I was 3 years old, and while she taught my brother. And I absorbed every moment of the lesson. And when she left, I played what I'd learned. I begged my mother at the age of 3. I said, I I want my own piano lessons, please, or whatever I said. I asked her for my own piano lessons, and she took me to our local pediatrician, Dr. Traub, to ask him if I was old enough to have piano lessons, and he said that was absolutely fine.
Good.
So that's the story of how I began playing the piano. Or
That's a real
actually,
chorus line moment. That's a I can do that moment. If you were a little ballet dancer with an older brother or sister and you wanted to put on their tap shoes, there's a song like that.
I don't think it was about putting on anyone's tap shoes. I think people who are musical, actually, I think children who are musical, children who are artistic, children who have a special gift of something, they find it, they identify it, and they pursue it in their own way. And I was fortunate that the lessons were at home and that I found I could ask for that, because actually I was the shyest child on the planet. And anyone who knew me as a child, I think until I was about 18, 19, 20, I was so shy. I, especially as a child. So I'm amazed that I even asked for that. But I do believe children find their way to, I think the gift speaks, and I encourage parents to be aware of this in their children. Uh, and I think the age of 3, 4, I think that's when the brain is such a sponge for absorbing learning. And uh, yeah,
So the
that's
music, well, the music finds you. So the music found you, you found it. It was, I think, what we've agreed. It was always going to find you, because that was the gift that was just there for you to grab, and you had a family that were
Mm.
giving it to you as well too,
Yeah,
or
I think
keen
so.
to.
And that said, music, art, painting, any gift or any pursuit that we find ourselves excelling in, it's not only the gift. I think there are a lot of gifted people walking around. Uh, it it's a lifetime of work as well.
Indeed. Well, so the work began then at a very young age. Tell me, so you started having lessons at home, the same teacher?
Yes, dear Mrs. Metaxas, who was originally from Greece and who had lived for some time in China, found herself living on Hall Street in Bondi, an extraordinary teacher who had also trained with another renowned Greek pianist. Some may not have heard of her, but Gina Bachau, her colleague, was an extraordinary and well known pianist at the time. So we were blessed to have Mrs. Metaxas in our lives.
For how many years did you stay with her? Because at some point, I know this is true of many concert pianists or concert musicians, that a certain point it's possible that one can outgrow a teacher, or that they feel they want to pass you on because they see the gift is that has that potential to go so much further than perhaps they feel, whether it's true or not, with that they feel they can give. How
Hmm.
long did you stay with her before you moved on?
So I stayed with Mrs. Metaxas till I was 13 years old. Uh, and I mean it when I say I was a really shy child. Uh, what was, because looking back, um, somehow I found the courage to say to my mother and father, I want to study with Nancy Salas at the conservatorium now. My mother, I think it was the first thing in my life that made her want to figuratively fall off her chair. Um, she was so attached to Mrs. Metaxas.
Good.
Uh, anyway, at that time, I changed teachers and went to study with Nancy Salas at the Sydney Conservatorium. I had kind of eyed her out, my as a child in Sydney at that time. There were few opportunities if you were not already in the conservatorium. Uh, there were few opportunities for pianists for pianist children uh, to figure out who the good teachers were.
Mm.
But it was through the Stedfords where I would play and listen to others and listen to players whose playing I thought was very interesting. And I learned that she had been their teacher. Anyway, that's uh, the way in which I discovered Nancy Salas in the days before global technology, and at a time when the music community in Sydney was much smaller. Nancy was extraordinary, if I may say. Nancy was born in 1910 in a tiny town in Broome in Western Australia, and by the time she by the time I met her, she had had three husbands. She used to tell me that for her honeymoon, which must have been in the early 1930s, she and her husband actually drove across central Australia
Oh, wow.
from one coast to the other. Can you imagine? That's a little bit of Nancy's incredible mind and spirit. Nancy uh, showed me as a teenager how to understand scores of Bach and Mozart and question the additions which we were using, and to understand uh, that Bach's music, for example, it's all spiritual. that said, behind much of it, there's also often a dance rhythm, and these are the kind, and it's through that dance rhythm that we explore then the character of the music.
This is an
These
interesting thing you say when you connect Bach with dance, because I've read this wonderful blog that you've published, of course, on your separate blog site about Nancy, and not just her musicianship at the various keyboards, piano, harpsichord, forte piano, but her interest in her very varied interest in music, which she must have made connections with you. So we're talking Bartok. I spotted that for a start.
yeah,
Dance, folk, the
yeah,
extraordinary mix of influences, and to connect that with Bach and even to you know to 20th century composers like
yeah,
Stockhausen, to have that as a young pianist must be
yeah.
extraordinary broadening.
Extraordinary broadness. Within a couple of years after Bartok passed away in the early 1950s, she established the Bartok Society of Australia and established a festival where all children and young teenagers, every student, once a year could come and play Bartok. And she was doing this, she was promoting the music of Bartok at a time in the 1950s and 60s when, in many places, Bartok had not even yet been recognized. She, even in the 1960s, went on a study tour that she created herself to Europe and met the sons of Bartok. This is how much uh, her mind was widely open. Before people were widely playing the early instruments such as the harpsichord and forte piano, the 18th century forte piano, she, on her study tour, went out of her way to meet Gustav Leonhardt, to meet Badura Skoda, people who were doing much research and performance on early instruments, and she was one of the first in her time and at any time to be exploring what this notation actually means on the page, what the music might have sounded like in its own time, and what do we do with all of that at a modern piano. So these are questions that I was presented with, can you imagine, at the ages of 14, 15, and 16. And
Quite
it,
an amazing thing to have that early. While I'm sure your contemporaries are having a very standard introduction to the classicists and probably a very narrow uh, repertoire as well.
I can't say that necessarily, Geoff. I think, uh, I think every teacher brings something special to their students. I have to say that. And it's often very different from what the next teacher brings, which, you know, thank you, universe, for the arts and for artists and for our individual way of looking at things, understanding what we're doing, and our individual ways of approaching and then playing. Because music, after we ingest all of this, these means of looking at a piece of music, we work for hours and hours and hours a day for years and years. Um, what's amazing to me is that finally, when an artist, a musician, is playing or singing, we're all so unique. And it's because of our uniqueness of mind, body, spirit, and soul. And all of that, all of those things I've just described emanate in a performance. And that, I have to say, is what has been so wrenchingly difficult in these last, where are we? November, 8 months, nearly to the day for me. I think my world shut down on March the 17th. with this pandemic, which means that I can't play for anyone live, nor can anyone else, pretty much, at least in this country. And and that has also been the case in Europe. Portions of Europe have tried to open up, but now, unfortunately, it seems that's not going to be the case for a while there either. It's wrenching to be an artist and to not have a listener in the room. It's similarly for me wrenching as an artist not to be able to go and hear other artists, because that for me is not only my joy, it's part of my life work. To I go to concerts. I'm speaking in the present notice. I
Please do. Our imagination will get us over this little period, and we'll be there soon enough, I'm sure.
Oh gosh, I hope so. I hope so.
The
Yeah.
alchemy of it all, clearly very important. Seeing, hearing others, all the influences along the way. Let's fast forward a little bit from your wonderful teacher and mentor Nancy um, to Juilliard School, because the opportunity to go to the Juilliard School must have been a dream come true. How old were you when that happened?
21.
Wonderful, my goodness, young woman going straight from home, straight from home,
Sorry.
straight from home to Juilliard School.
That's the short story. The not much. The slightly longer version is not very different. I mean, basically, I was guided by Nancy Salas, who promised me that I would love New York. So Nancy was amazing not only with music, she was also amazing with people, and she could see right through anybody. And she predicted that I would fall in love with New York, and I did. Not straight away. The first 1.5 years were tough as tough could be. Uh, However, I do love this city. Basically, um, I was advised, as I think many musicians are, you go and audition for teachers to see if they'll accept you, but while they're auditioning you, you're also auditioning them. Because the most important thing for a performing artist is their relationship, their relationship with pianist mentor or musician mentor relationship is an extraordinary relationship for building an artist. So you want to choose that very carefully. So I came here, auditioned for several people at different music schools, not only in New York, also at Cornell University, and also at Bloomington, the in Bloomington School of Music in Indiana. I knew very quickly that New York was the place I wanted to be, and that Mr. Gorodnitsky was the teacher I wanted to study with. And so, yes, I pretty much went straight from Sydney into Juilliard, and New York was not the place then that it is now. So I became street smart very fast.
But you must have taken to the study like a duck to water, because there was not just the bachelor's degree, then followed a master's. I think you then at another university even completed your doctorate as well too. So yeah, I know education is hugely important to you, and your master classes and your teaching as well. But in terms of your career as a performer, in parallel to this extraordinary academic side as well too, and specializing in particular composers, and in the performances thereof. Um, I want to ask you about. Well, there's a number of stories I want to ask you about, but in terms of performing and the Bach, the well-tempered clavier, that the preludes and fugues, which you performed famously in a number of cities and a number of countries, but among others for Prince Charles, if I'm not mistaken, at Kensington Palace. Tell me about how that happened, because you must have performed before that as well, the same repertoire.
Yeah, I didn't actually play the well-tempered clavier for Charles. Uh, I performed Chopin for him, and Prince William and Prince Harry
Oh,
when they were very very young. It was a complete honor. It truly was. Basically, the palace had learned of my performance of the Well-Tempered Clavier in England earlier that year, and they knew I had been a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth Silver Jubilee Award for Young Australians, of which Prince Charles had been the patron. And that's how that invitation came to be.
You played also in New York the same repertoire and at the Sydney Opera House, but onwards to Chopin for the Royals. Wow.
Wonder later on how on earth you did that.
Oh, my word, my word, my word. And then, of course, the Goldberg Variations famously as well, too. Extraordinary as well, too. We heard a little bit there. I'm going to connect you with another Goldberg Variation story in a moment, and maybe we might go there in a second. Do you want to play something for us? It doesn't have to be that at all. Is there something you would like to play for us at this point, a little something, and then we'll come back to the story, maybe a couple of amazing things in New York that I want to touch on before we talk more about the present?
Sure. So I'd love to play some Schumann. This is the third movement of Schumann's Fantasy, Opus 17. Schumann had been so deeply in love with the pianist Clara Wieck, who was 9 years younger than him. And for a very, very long time, he felt thwarted in his pursuit of his love for her because of Clara's father, Frederick Wieck. Frederick Wieck had been Schumann's professor of piano, and he strongly objected to the romantic relationship of his daughter to Robert Schumann, so much so that he actually went to court to try and persuade the judge that Schumann was an alcoholic, which of course he was not. And the judge refuted the case, and finally Schumann was allowed to pursue his love of Clara. And Schumann actually wrote to Clara. He wrote a letter to Clara and he said, "Here is my fantasy. It is a piece professing my love for you, and in it there is a hidden melody. Can you hear it? Because it describes you." This is the third movement of Schumann's Fantasy, Opus 17.
Oh, bravo, bravo, Sarah. We are listening to and speaking with Australian pianist Sarah Grunstein in New York. And we were talking about the terrible frustration of being able to be in concert halls live, but one strangely ironic treat is to be able to be listening and speaking across the world as we are now live with people listening in and will later tune in and look at their own time as well at this and listen to that. Thank you so much for that beautiful Schumann. That was just a delight. And in your own room.
Thank you.
We also are going to hear you around this time next week. So we look forward to that. We'll talk about that in a little while. And we'll hear about that in a moment. There's a couple of New York stories I want to get to if we have time. One of them is about sort of where we left off the story a little bit earlier, around Juilliard school time. But it's a taxi trip, just briefly, because it's an amazing story. You jump in a taxi, it's New York, and the driver starts you in conversation. What happens?
Okay. By the way, there were 7 empty taxis coming along, and this happened to be the first taxi, and I got in. And the driver in this old checker cab is turning around and staring at me. Every traffic light, he's turning around and staring at me. And while he's driving, he's checking me out in his rearview mirror. And here am I in what was not safe New York at the time, thinking, what on is going on here and what am I going to do? If I had not been in such a rush, I would have gotten out of the taxi. It did not feel, that is not behavior a young a young Australian woman in New York felt safe with at
Right.
any time, especially then. In any case, I realized that as he started talking with me, he stared at me less, so I engaged with him. And he said, "Oh, you must be from England." "No, I'm from Australia." "Oh," he said, "I know people in Australia." And I thought,
Of course.
13 million at the time, but I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Uh, who do you know in Australia?" And he mentioned 5 names of people. Of course, I didn't know them. His next question, "Are you from Sydney or Melbourne?" As if I couldn't be from anywhere else. And I said, "I'm from Sydney." And he said, "Oh, no wonder you don't know those people. They're all from Melbourne." And I said, "That's why I don't know them." And I'm thinking in my head, well, now we're down to about 3 million in Sydney at the time. But I was determined to keep this conversation going because it stopped him staring at me like this. And I said, "Well, who do you know in Sydney?" "Oh, I know 2 people in Sydney." He said, "2 people." And uh, I said, "Well, that's very nice." He goes, "Oh, I can't remember their names. What's their names? I can't remember their last names." I said, "Well, who are these people? What's their last names?" He said. And then he goes, "I remember their first names, Hanya and Bolek." And I said, "Well, how do you know these people?" And he said, "Well, I was in several concentration camps with Bolek, the man, in Poland and Germany between 1943 and 1945." And he mentioned the names of some of the camps. And he said at the end of the war, they were all transferred to a uh, town set up by the Red Cross for displaced persons, a town in Bavaria called Egenfelden. And he said, so we were all in this town, this displaced persons town, for a couple of years. The taxi driver said, "This is where I met my wife to be. We had an engagement party, and in fact, they attended." And he said, "Then I don't remember why, but Hanya, the woman, she had to go to Sweden. I don't know why she went to Sweden. But she ended up in Sweden, and Bolek tried to follow her to go to Sweden, but he was not allowed to go to Sweden. He couldn't get papers." He said, Bolek ended up in Sydney, and Hanya followed him, and they ended up getting married in Sydney, and they set up a dress factory. I'm sitting in the back of the taxi. The whole taxi would have been shaking. I was shaking so much. I was clutching my forearms like this. A, they were shaking, and B, I was trying to get myself to wake up. I thought I was in a dream. I was like this, like clutching myself to stop shaking and get myself to snap out of this. And he said, "Hanya and Bolek," and he's slapping the steering wheel. "What's their last names?" I can't remember their last names. Finally, I could get myself together, and I said to him through the glass barricade of this old checker cab, I said, "Is their last name Grunstein?" He goes, "What?" I said, "Grunstein. Is it Bolek and Hanya Grunstein?" He goes, "Grunstein, Bolek and Hanya Grunstein." He said, "You know them." And I said, I'm still like this. Like, if I haven't woken up now, I'm not going to wake up. And I said, "Excuse me, sir." I said, "Do you know those 2 people are my mother and my father?" At which point he slammed his foot on the brakes and we almost went through our respective glass barriers. But that was the story. And he said, "Oh my gosh, my wife's going to be so thrilled, and you must come to our home in Queens this Friday night for Shabbat dinner." I remember this day very well because, do you know, it was election day.
Oh,
It was
goodness.
Tuesday of November. And, uh, uh, and then at the very end, I don't think either of us ever recovered from that moment. And I did stay in touch with him and met his family 3 nights later. And I'm in touch with one of his daughters. But he said to me before I got out of the taxi, he said, I didn't know if you're in the entertainment business or what. He goes, but you really look like your mother.
Wow.
That's my taxi driver story.
That's extraordinary, and no wonder he was staring at you the whole time.
Yeah. Actually, I could show you a portrait of my mother that's painted by my father that's on the other side of my room. Shall I get up? You'll have a blank screen here for a moment.
No, do it for a second, and I'll give the details of. Yes, go ahead.
I will excuse me, audience, for about 30
No,
seconds.
excuse. I shall chat in the meantime and remind everybody of next week's concert as well too, which is worthwhile drawing your attention to, because next Sunday morning at about 11:30, I think we're going live to where is a beautiful concert live from New York that Sarah is performing from her studio there, from her apartment, and it's a soirée, a beautiful soirée in the 360-degree view. And that will be in her Manhattan apartment on that beautiful Steinway that you're looking at, because, of course, she is a Steinway artist. And here she comes with this portrait by her father.
This portrait, my father, an artist, painted of my mother exactly at that time. My mother was in Sweden, and he sent this to her for her birthday. And this is, can you see? It's going to get some reflection. I'm trying.
Beautiful. No, you can straighten that. It's fine. Yeah.
I can see what the reflection is. No, there's some other reflection on it.
If you just angle it slightly up or down, we're good. Yeah, that's fine.
Here we go.
Oh,
now
my word.
The other light.
Yes, yes. Well, I can see why the taxi driver was staring at you, Sarah.
There is my mother at the time. The taxi driver knew her, had last seen her. Let me turn this light on again. And when I went, if I need to turn that light off again, let me know, because I'm going to show you these 2 photos. I'm going to put them right in front of my laptop. These little 2x2s are from 1947 of the taxi driver's engagement. And on my left, in each photo, you will see my mother. Now, tell me if I need to dim any lights here.
Them down. We can see them if you hold them nice and still and just up a little, angle up a bit. Beautiful.
Can you see them?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, so on my left, there's a woman there, my mother. Can you imagine this taxi driver gave me these photos when I met him in his home 3 days later?
In like 1983, we're talking?
Yes.
Something like, yes.
And in the center back of this photo, yes. Can you still see it?
Mm-hmm.
My uncle Joseph, my mother's brother, who is in Stockholm. My mother's brothers remained in Sweden.
Wow. Uncle
Joseph, he's very well, thank God, and he turns 98 next month. And imagine a taxi driver gives you the photographs when you.
I was going to say only in New York, but even in New York, that's just ridiculous that can happen.
And you get into this man's taxi. Yeah. That story, I think, is the most powerful thing to this day that ever happened to me.
I bet. Well, I have one more story to ask you about, and we're getting to the end of our time. But before we do, this sort of ties things in, I suppose, in a slightly melancholy way with what's happening all around us, and certainly very much in New York. But there's a beautiful piece that I know that you wrote and that appeared in the New York Times, and this is a gorgeous piece about your neighbor. This is George Wolfe, and if you would just take us a little bit about this relationship, because it's a beautiful story about a couple of things we've talked about. We've talked about cats, and we have seen your cat in the background there, by the way, while you were
Oh,
playing
yeah.
earlier. Oh yes, no, no, made a beautiful appearance. But
No,
the
trust.
noise was mine. That was my cat that was talking earlier. He listened, by the way, to the Schumann and has gone to sleep on the couch in heaven. Um, Loving that. But what connects us with with the current crisis and all our health concerns is this story. Tell us about your neighbour George Wolfe and how you met him.
Okay, so I moved to this building in great haste and under a lot of stress 4 years ago because uh, I was leaving an apartment that had constant water damage, let's just put it that way. So I had to find a place very quickly. Imagine finding a place very quickly with when you've got your father's paintings, two 17-year-old cats at the time, and a number of pianos, and it's between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and you've got to move apartments in New York City. Anyway, I did. Imagine the stress I felt upon moving here. But the day I moved here, there was a note under my door. It was a card in an envelope, and I opened it. On the front of this card was a beautiful card of a cat, and I opened up the card, and this note said, "Dear Sarah, I understand you're a concert pianist and that you love cats. I too love music and cats. I'm your new neighbor, George. Welcome to the building, and please let me know if there's anything I can help you with." Can you imagine that?
What a welcome.
You know, some people think New York is a rough and tough city. It's a tough city, but the most extraordinary people are here. Anywhere, actually. I have to say I'm blessed. I am blessed in my life. Good people tend to come my way, and I feel very blessed by that. George and I, as you can imagine, developed a friendship. George, at the time, 4 years ago, was 88 years old. He born in Czechoslovakia, escaped Czechoslovakia at the age of 9 years old. His parents took him and his brother through France, and they escaped to Switzerland, where they managed to then leave Switzerland and come to the United States. So, uh, fortunately for him, he was not part of the disaster, the tragedy of the Holocaust. Uh, However, that whole entire time was in his history, and he was actually a translator he went back to Europe to serve in the US Army, and because of his gift in languages, became a translator for the Nuremberg trials, which is
Oh wow,
incredible.
wow.
George and I shared an amazing friendship. His late wife had been a pianist. He loved music, and he would often come to my soirees that I hold, present tense when there is no pandemic, in my apartment on Saturday evenings. I have people over, friends, and serve wine and cheese. I talk about the program I'm about to play, just as I will next week. I play my program, and then we enjoy beautiful desserts and dialogue and friendships in the room. And George used to love coming to my soirees and always asked me to put aside. There's a purple chair just behind my laptop, from my piano, and he said always, "Please save my purple chair for me. I need to have the best view of your hands." Uh, it was truly an amazing friendship. He had no other family, and he developed friendships not only with me, but with uh, another another young woman in the building, Rena, who had been my next door neighbor at the time, and with Joey and Tom, two gentlemen on another floor. We kind of became his family. Sadly for George, he developed pneumonia, was taken to hospital on the 29th of March, at Mount Sinai, and within a week he had been transferred to a local rehab nursing home somewhere, either in the hospital or the nursing home. He had contracted COVID, uh, and he really suffered in the next 3 months. He did recover from COVID extraordinarily. He had other underlying issues from a cancer, and finally passed away of some complications due to that. What was wrenching every day of those 3 months between the end of March and the 28th of June was that he was completely alone in the nursing home and or the hospital, and finally in the hospice. Every single of those days, I did, however, finally, when he got to hospice, I was able to reach out to the director of the hospice home, and who responded to me straight away. I had emailed to say, could I please arrange to play the piano for George on Zoom. If you can believe this, he was transferred there on a Friday afternoon, and I got a response. This amazing recreational director called me at like 4:30 on a Friday and arranged our Zoom recital that I could play for him the next day. So that, I have to say, was an absolute blessing. Uh, it for me, for me, that I was able. I hope it was for him. I believe it was, but I'm speaking as a human, the human being that's left here on earth, to
Of
just
course.
say thank you, God, that I was able to have that time of communication with his soul in the 24 hours before he passed away.
And just to close that off, because it's a beautiful image, I know that you played, well, that after he passed, you went on and continued what was going to be
Mm,
a performance. And
mm,
two things happened. One,
mm,
I'll say it, I think you said Kaddish for him,
mm,
and then you played his
mm,
favorite
mm,
Goldberg variation.
mm.
That's a gift across the ether, and which
Yeah,
we can
I
feel.
think,
Yeah.
I believe we reach souls who aren't here. And I had played for him while he was still alive on the Saturday afternoon, and with the recreational director, rescheduled it again for 3 o'clock on the Sunday. And George had passed away at something like 2 o'clock. But here was I had this Zoom meeting set up. Now we had been, for the second time, we'd been able to include uh, about four of his very close friends, and we still had that Zoom set up. So I reached out to these people and said, can we still do this? We can convene together and for George. And we did. And that's when Rena and I said, Kaddish for George. And then I played. Uh, so it was uh, a very, very spiritual time. Incredibly, following that, about an hour later, there was the most gigantic rainbow. So these are Venetian blinds you see here. I've drawn them for tonight, but there was the most gigantic rainbow you've ever seen in your life outside these windows.
My
So
word.
that was the little coda to the story.
That yes, indeed, that doesn't need any words. But Sarah, you are going to play for us next weekend, and we very much look forward to what I think we might call a simulcast. You're going to be broadcasting from New York in 360 degrees, 11:30 a.m. our time, evening your time, across the waves, New York, Sydney, Melbourne, everywhere. Anybody who wants to tune in, certainly anyone who's watching us now on Dunera, can find all the details there and register for that concert. It will be magnificent. And I note that you've said that we should get some coffee and tea, some nibblies, and there was mention of a glass of wine might be appropriate.
If you the recital in Australia time will be at 11:30 a.m. If you're brunch, wine, or cocktail people, that
I think, as they say, it's after 5 o'clock somewhere in the world, and if it's okay for you, then it'll be okay for us.
exactly.
Sarah Grunstein, it's been an absolute joy and a privilege to chat with you in your home at this time, live in New York. I know it's a tough time, but these connections are what keep us going. And we look forward, we pray, we can't wait for the time when we will see you again in the same place, in the same concert hall, Sydney, Melbourne, New York, wherever it might be, um, and, together and hear that beautiful music. Thank you for playing for us as well today, not just for telling your story, moving and exciting and inspiring as it has been.
Geoff, I thank you very, very much, and to you and Dunera and to all my audience, thank you so much for your support. It's been wonderful, wonderful speaking with you, Geoff. Thank you so much to you and to Dunera for this opportunity.
Well, it is a great, great pleasure. And thank you very much. And we will see you next weekend. Sarah Grunstein, goodbye. Good evening to you. Good morning to everyone else. And we'll see you very, very soon. Bye.